I've had a sore throat all weekend, but it's history time, so let's get going. Bonjour tout le monde, and welcome to episode 4 of Turn Back the Clock with Stock. A lot of complicated stuff happened in French history today. I'll do my best to simplify it for you. On September 14th, 1791, Louis XVI accepts the first constitution of France. Now, the French Revolution had been going on for about 2 years, and since the beginning of that, the National Assembly had been working to create this constitution. Now, the Marquis de Lafayette, and you may remember him from last week's video, he wanted to combine the best parts of the British Constitution and the best parts of the American Constitution into the French Constitution, and he especially wanted the king to have the power of veto. The final draft gave the king executive powers, it gave the National Assembly legislative powers, and it also gave the judiciary branch its own powers separately from those two. Now, in the United States, all three branches work together, but here the judiciary system is separate. It also abolished feudalism, and it established the departments, which are the governmental systems that France is divided into today. Very similar to how we're the state of Indiana, but we're divided into counties. It's very similar to that in France. Now, this constitution failed when Louis XVI refused to create a militia to defend the government from the oncoming war. And this would be the big fighting part during the French Revolution. Not a lot of people remember or recognize that there was a lot of politics during the French Revolution, a lot of discussion, a lot of debates. And the fighting actually came a little bit later. The National Convention elected Robespierre as France's first deputy when Louis XVI would not raise that militia. And Robespierre, we'll probably talk about him later in another episode. And on September 22nd, 1792, so that's coming up, and I'll talk more about it in next week's video, but France is declared a republic by the National Convention. So that was a big step in French history right there. On September 16, 1380, we have the death of Charles V, also known as Charles the Wise. Now, he had done a lot during the 100 Years' War to kind of contain and retain a lot of French territory. But upon his death, the successors were unable to maintain that. They were ineffectual, they were incompetent, and some of them were just plain lazy. And so that's when England came in and really established a stronghold in the French country. Very, very tumultuous time in French history, the 100 Years' War. So moving on now to September 18th, 1595, Pope Clement VIII removes the ban of excommunication from Henry IV. Now, there were two Henry IVs, Henry IV of England, Henry IV of France. We're talking about the French one. This is one of the most complicated and convoluted historical events that I've ever encountered. There are just so many people acting and interacting, and so many ideas and things in play. It's hard to keep track of. Essentially, Henry IV is excommunicated for heresy. He was set to become the next king of France, but the Pope was afraid that if he became the king of France in this kind of religious limbo, it would create another schism. And the schism that happened with England was something that the Roman Church, that the Pope wanted to avoid. And I'll put a link down in the description about the English schism if you want to learn more about that. To avoid this schism, Pope Clement VIII, he gave Henry IV not only absolution, but he removed the ban of excommunication. What this allowed Henry IV to do is that now he was the legitimate king of France, and he was able to pull certain areas together that had been resisting him because they didn't recognize him as the true king. He was also able to marry Marie de Medici, which extended the French influence into Italy. So that's a very elementary simplification of what happened. That whole thing blows my mind. Now, on September 19th, 1356, we have the Battle of Poitiers. And the Battle of Poitiers, along with the Battle of Crécy and the Battle of Agincourt, are three main battles in the Hundred Years' War, and they were all won by the English. The Battle of Poitiers was very complicated, and you remember how Washington attacked the British on Christmas Day when he crossed the Delaware? It was that sort of thinking that allowed the British to beat the French during the Hundred Years' War. They used unconventional tactics. It also led to the capture of the King of France. And after it was all over, Jean de Venette, who was a Carmelite friar and a medieval historian, he describes all of the chaos which he witnessed by saying this: "From that time on, all went wrong with the kingdom, and the state was undone. Thieves and robbers rose up everywhere in the land. The nobles despised and hated all others, and took no thought for the mutual usefulness and profit of lord and men. They subjected and despoiled the peasants and the men of their villages. In no wise did they defend their country from enemies. Rather did they trample it underfoot, robbing and pillaging the peasants' goods." Excuse me. So that tells you that it was a very difficult time for the French. So that's this week in French history. I hope next week I'm feeling a little bit better so I can be a little more interesting. I've looked ahead. There are quite a few interesting things that happen next week in French history, so I'm looking forward to bringing you those. Until then, I'm planning on taking Monday off to rest up and recover a little bit, and I will see all of you on Tuesday. A bientôt! Yeah!